Treaties are agreements made between the Indigenous people and the Government of Canada that set out continuing treaty rights and benefits for each group. First Nations representatives wish to negotiate the peaceful sharing of land in exchange for services that would enable them to survive the loss of their traditional lifestyle and fully participate in the new economy.
After researching the numbered treaties in Canada, especially the Alberta numbered treaties 6, 7, and 8, we were shocked at the amount of promises that were made and went unfulfilled. Most of the treaties can be described the same way: the potential to be a fair agreement, but having a significant deficit on the part of the Government of Canada. The relationship between the Aboriginal people and Canada was supposed to be a mutual contract, but quickly became a power trip for the Government of Canada. They abused their power and negatively affected the rightful owners of the land when Canada used the treaties for assimilation, land surrendering, and trust abuse.
A course outline is a contract between the teacher and the student that agrees the teacher will test what is on the course outline, and if the student can meet those standards, they can receive a certain grade. When a teacher does not grade or mark according to the course outline, it makes us frustrated as students. Each party should be responsible to hold up their end of the contract. Imagine if this contract between the teacher and the student was for a project that was worth 100% of the student's grade. The student could blame the teacher for unfair marking, and the teacher could blame the student for not meeting requirements. But what if the teacher gave the student a course outline that was in French? What if the teacher gave the student a course outline that was missing a category? What if the teacher did not supply a course outline at all? Whose fault is it now? What if this contract was not for a simple grade and instead was for an entire piece of land and its rights for all future generations? You would think that the negotiations and processes to create this contract would be handled much more seriously. In reality, what this government did is exactly what this teacher did. The government was deliberately not holding up their end of the contract and trying to trick the Aboriginal people into thinking that they had.
We have learned over the course of our treaty education in class and in our own research that the treaties were always as significant as we believed. However, the colonial myth we were taught in grade school is significantly different than the real story, as the colonial myth is only from the perspective of the white man and is only a narrative, not a reality.
The treaties represent misunderstandings and purposeful misleadings rather than a mutual agreement between two parties who speak a completely different language and have completely different ways of life. The actions of the Crown further show its refusal to recognize its commitment to treaties and how they instead turned to the Indian Act they created to legislate all policies regarding Indigenous people.
Even as time passed, the promises that were supposed to be honored in the treaties receded even further from the government's priorities, and ultimately, the Crown failed to protect its Aboriginal communities.
Treaty 6 was signed by Crown representatives and Cree, Assiniboine, and Ojibwa leaders on the 23rd of August, 1876 at Fort Carlton, Saskatchewan, and on the 9th of September, 1876 at Fort Pitt, Saskatchewan. The treaty boundaries extend across central portions of present-day Alberta and Saskatchewan. You will always be cared for, all the time, as long as the sun walks to what they promised. As long as the sun walks, as long as the river flows. The treaty made many references to the sun and its everlasting nature. When the Aboriginal chiefs signed the treaty, they believed they would be taken care of until the sun stopped shining. They were misled by the government to sign a treaty they did not fully understand. Many Cree leaders accepted the terms, but Cree chief Big Bear resisted signing the treaty to reach better terms for his people. However, there was an enormous power imbalance, and Big Bear was forced to sign the treaty so his people wouldn't starve. This questions the morality of the treaty because the Crown was forcing the chiefs who wanted better terms to give in to their demands if they wanted their people to survive. I grew up in Grand Prairie, which is 400 kilometers northeast of Edmonton. Grand Prairie is on Treaty 8 land, which belonged to the Cree and Dene. Growing up, I had no idea Grand Prairie was even on Treaty 8 land. We weren't taught in school to recognize the land, and we were never told by anyone that treaties were significant parts of our history as Canadian citizens. Because of this, I feel cheated in my education and feel that I was led into believing a false narrative. This impacted my perspective of treaties and Aboriginal people as a whole, because I never knew anything different. If we would have had treaty education when I was in school, I wouldn't have had such negative stereotypes of Indigenous people and could have fought against the social engineering that was present in my life from such an early age. With this knowledge, I could have challenged the dominant view of my community and helped steer people in the right direction and help them understand what I do now. EDU 211 has given me the knowledge that has made it possible for me to push past my ignorance and come to terms with how wrong my thinking was. I am now on the path that I should have been all along, and this knowledge will help me be the teacher who doesn't reduce their students down to stereotypes. I am now able to see the social engineering that is present in my hometown, and I look forward to engaging in productive dialogue with my friends and family about what I know in regards to treaties and how it affects our home.
The True Spirit and Original Intent of Treaty 7 by Sarah Carter, Dorothy First Rider, and Walter Hildebrandt documents testimony from over 80 elders from the First Nations involved in the negotiation process. It was their belief from oral history that they were signing a peace treaty in which they agreed to share the land with the settlers in exchange for resources to ensure their economic growth and survival. This was not the case, however, due to a lack of accurate interpretation by the Commissioner's interpreters and intentional misleading. This promise of education in the treaties paved the way for the creation of residential schools, the Canadian government's way of providing education to First Nation communities. As well, the imbalance of power was now a part of the Canadian government's arsenal towards their mistreatment of First Nations and the resulting breach of trust in the following decades to come. Over the course of EDU 211, my knowledge base for Indigenous education has increased tenfold, and for this I'm extremely grateful to my instructor. As a pre-service teacher, heading into the final years of my degree, having this wealth of new knowledge and resources has increased my confidence drastically. I feel a personal connection to Treaty 7 in my experience as a camp counselor on Treaty 7 territory, and look forward to incorporating this new knowledge base into my programming and ongoing teaching pedagogy. As a counselor, I can already start utilizing treaty education, giving the students a new perspective on the history of the land they live on by incorporating an Indigenous understanding of the treaties. While this will most likely challenge their current understanding, initiating the change is more effective in younger adolescents who will start on a new path of understanding. Treaties are what set the foundation in Canada for a shared coexistence and should be common knowledge amongst all Canadians. My role as a teacher is then vital in achieving this goal, and I will view it as a disservice to my profession and country if I continue the streak of blissful ignorance amongst Canadians who refuse to be educated on the dark history of how Indigenous Canadians were so poorly treated.
Treaty 8 was signed in 1899 at Lesser Slave Lake. Treaty 8 is the largest of the numbered treaties, which included two major Aboriginal language groups, who were the Cree and Dene, including Chippewas, Beavers, Slaveys, Dogribs, and Yellowknives. The Crown realized that it financially benefited them to recognize Aboriginal rights in the treaty so that they could balance the settlement of land by non-Aboriginal people and reserving the lands for Aboriginal people. Also, the Aboriginal people could be employed as agricultural laborers on their own land. The written document recorded in English by Canadian government representatives did not record the full extent of the oral agreement. Few Aboriginal signatories could read English, and many did not understand the English used in the writing of the treaties and Treaty 8 when they were signed. Growing up and going to school in Edmonton, I was taught to believe that the treaties were actually a good thing that the Canadian government did. I really believed that Canada was as inclusive and trustworthy as our textbooks and teachers taught us. I remember learning about treaties only in social class, and when my teachers taught it, they made it sound like a shared agreement between two people, and we never learned about the consequences treaties had for Aboriginal people and their future generations. I thought that the treaties helped more than they hurt and gave more than they took. However, this digital essay has taught me that the Canadian government never intended to help the Aboriginal people. They only intended to do what was best for themselves. EDU 211 and this digital essay has taught me so much about the real history of treaties, not what the government wants us to think. If we really are on the path for reconciliation, the government should acknowledge what they did wrong and teach this to students so the same mistakes will never be made again. Treaties has not only taught me to be an informed changemaker for treaty education, but it has also taught me about relationships. I want to be someone that my students can trust will give them the right information, not continue reproducing the white man's narrative. In my classroom, I will be respectful to my students and make sure that they understand the full and real story of treaties and all information that I teach. Treaty education is a form of critical peace building that challenges the epistemologies of ignorance and turns them into sites of inquiry.
Peace-building education is helping students make connections to treaties and treaty relationship, helping them see how their lives continue to be impacted by treaties and understanding the implications of dishonoring the treaties for Aboriginal Canadian relations.
It is important to start teaching treaty education to children when they are younger rather than older, as treaty education prepares students to be ethically conscious Canadians and more effective, thoughtful citizens of the world. We know as pre-service teachers that treaty education is teaching life lessons and learning alongside them. Treaty education creates spaces and opportunities for students to understand the contemporary issues faced by Aboriginal peoples and to consider their own responsibilities in shaping a different future for all Canadians. The Alberta TQS objective states that teachers must understand the historical, social, economic, and political implications of treaties and agreements with First Nations.
In every classroom, we can use the Brown Eyes, Blue Eyes lesson to help our students understand what the treaty negotiations were like. In a physical education class, we would do this by playing a game of stones or flyback outside. We would have one team have a clear advantage, such as having more players, giving one team a head start, or bending the rules in favor of one team. After each student would get a chance to be on the advantage team and disadvantage team, we would stop to have a group reflection about the feelings we experienced on both teams. We would then enter into a group discussion about how the Aboriginal people felt when they were signing the treaties.
Treaty education is not just teaching students about treaties, it's teaching them lessons that will help them become better people. In our schools, this can be accomplished by many social justice initiatives such as cereal drives, Project of Hearts, and fundraisers. However, instead of letting these initiatives go unnoticed, we would ask our students to reflect on the life lessons they learned and how it could be related to one of the lessons that treaties teach us.
The most important way that treaties and treaty education has impacted our teaching practices is recognizing that the treaties are a part of our history as well. When we incorporate treaty education into our teaching practices, we cannot teach it as though it is only Aboriginal people's history.
As Canadian citizens, we need to be held accountable and take responsibility for what the Canadian government did. We should not feel guilty about what our ancestors have done, but recognize that we need to be change makers to help be a solution.
In today's society, treaties need to be recognized and their implications in Aboriginal people's lives need to be acknowledged, so that we can all become treaty people and supporters of treaty education.